Clara Bennett had $42, a dead man's rifle, and a land deed with her name on it, and the moment she arrived in Holt's Creek, Harlan Briggs told her she would sign it over or leave in pieces. She didn't sign. She didn't leave. What she did instead changed everything for her, for the silent mountain cowboy who had spent 3 years trying to disappear, and for every woman in that valley who had been told her name meant nothing on paper. If you believe a woman with nothing left can still win everything that matters, subscribe to this channel. Stay with me until the very last word, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Bennett had made exactly 3 promises to herself the morning she left Millhaven, Kansas. She would not cry, she would not look back, and she would not need anyone. She had kept 2 of them. The crying had started somewhere around the 2nd day, when the wagon wheel cracked against a rock and she'd had to climb down alone in the July heat to wedge a branch under the axle. Not because it hurt, not because she was afraid, but because Thomas would have laughed at her for trying and then climbed down himself and fixed it before she'd even gotten her skirts properly lifted, and the memory of his laugh had hit her somewhere behind her sternum like a closed fist. She'd cried then, ugly, graceless, with dirt on her hands and sweat running down the back of her neck. Then she'd fixed the wheel herself, climbed back up, and kept going. That was 6 weeks ago. Now the wheel was broken again, this time beyond fixing, and the horse was lame, and the storm that had been building since noon had finally decided to stop threatening and start delivering. Rain hit the high Colorado Trail like it had a grudge. The kind of rain that didn't fall so much as a tack, driving sideways off the mountain face, turning packed dirt into something that sucked at Clara's boots and made every step feel like a negotiation. She had $42 sewn into the hem of her coat, a carpet bag with 2 dresses, a schoolteacher's ledger of letters of introduction, and a daguerreotype of Thomas she hadn't been able to leave behind, even though looking at it still felt like pressing on a bruise. She had a name, Holt's Creek, a settlement 2 days' ride into the San Juan Range, where a woman named Edith Morrow had written to say there was work, decent people, and land a widow could file claim on through the new territorial provisions. She did not have a working wagon. She did not have a working horse. She did not have any idea how far she still had to go. Clara stood in the rain and assessed the situation the way Thomas had taught her to assess a difficult student, without panic, without sentiment, and without pretending the problem was smaller than it was. The problem was considerable. "All right," she said aloud, because silence in a situation like this felt like giving up. "All right, think." The trail had climbed steadily for the last 3 hours. To her left, the mountain rose in shelves of dark granite. To her right, the drop was not sheer, but it was steep, and the rain was making it look worse than it probably was, and she was choosing to believe that. Behind her, the road she'd come up was already a memory of mud. Ahead, through the curtain of rain, she could see the faint silhouette of tree cover spruce and aspen climbing the slope, which meant there might be shelter, which meant there might be a chance of waiting this out. She took what she could carry: the carpet bag, the coat with the money in the hem. The rifle Thomas had pressed into her hands the morning she'd left, saying, "You won't need it, but take it anyway." She had argued with him about that. She wished she hadn't wasted the time. The horse, a bony sorrel mare named Patience, who had earned her name over 6 weeks of difficult road, looked at Clara with the long-suffering expression of an animal who had seen this coming and was not surprised. "I'm sorry," Clara told her. "I'll come back for you." Whether that was true or not remained to be seen. She walked for 40 minutes through the rain before she found the overhang, a shelf of rock jutting out from the slope, far enough to cut most of the weather. Not dry, not warm, but less catastrophically wet than the alternative. She crawled under it, pulled her coat tight, and started calculating how long she could wait before waiting became its own kind of problem. The answer, she figured, was morning. If the storm broke by dawn, she could go back for Patience, assess whether the mare could be ridden at all, and make a decision from there. If the storm didn't break by dawn, she didn't finish that thought. A sound pulled her out of it. Not the rain, not the wind working through the trees above her. Something else. Something that moved with a purpose the weather didn't have. Clara had the rifle up and the hammer back before the lantern light crested the rise. "Hold it right there," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She was grateful for that. The lantern stopped. There was a long moment, long enough for the rain to fill the silence, long enough for Clara's arms to remind her they'd been carrying a carpet bag for the better part of an hour, and then a voice came out of the dark behind the light. Low, unhurried, the voice of a man who wasn't startled, which meant either he'd seen her before she'd seen him or he simply didn't startle. "You always point guns at people trying to bring you out of the rain, or just me?" "Step into the light," Clara said. "I'm holding the light." "Step where I can see you then." A pause. Then the lantern moved and the man holding it stepped forward far enough for the glow to catch his face. He was tall. That was the first thing, not the reassuring tall of a man who'd grown into himself, but the kind of tall made the space around him feel differently proportioned. Like the mountain had made him and hadn't bothered scaling him to ordinary human dimensions. Dark hair, longer than fashionable, pushed back from a face that was all weather and patience, and something else she couldn't name. A beard trimmed close, eyes that caught the lantern light and gave nothing back. He was wearing a canvas coat dark with rain and a hat that had seen better decades. His hands, she noted, Thomas had taught her to note, hands were empty except for the lantern. He looked at the rifle without any particular concern. "You've got 2 shots," he said. "Maybe 3 if that's a Henry and not a Springfield. Either way, I've got a cabin half a mile up the ridge with a dry stove and a roof that doesn't leak, and you look like a woman who's been making do with worse than this for longer than she should have." "I don't know you," Clara said. "You don't." That's not a reassuring response. Wasn't meant to be reassuring. Was meant to be honest. He tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's reading something he's not quite sure of. "Name's Wyatt Callahan. I run the scout cabin up on the North Ridge. Been on this mountain for 3 years, and in that time, nobody who's come to the cabin has left worse than they arrived. A beat. That's the closest thing to a recommendation I've got on short notice." Clara did not lower the rifle, but she thought about it. "What were you doing out in this weather?" she asked. "Heard a horse in distress about a mile back on the trail. Went to check." His jaw shifted slightly, lame sorrel. "Wagon's done. Figured whoever belonged to the wagon either found shelter or didn't." His eyes moved over her, not the way some men's eyes moved, cataloging and appraising, but something more careful than that. "More practical. You found shelter. I found a rock overhang." "Better than nothing." Marginally. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the shape a smile would make if it was remembering what smiling was for. "You want to stand here in the rain arguing about the relative merits of rock overhangs, or you want to come out of the weather?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. Her arms were shaking cold, not fear, she told herself firmly, and the water was finding its way past her collar and down her back in a thin, miserable stream. And the $42 in her hem was doing her no good if she died of exposure on a Colorado mountainside 2 days' ride from a settlement she hadn't even confirmed existed. "If you try anything," she said, "I want you to know I'm a very good shot." "I'll keep that in mind," he said. "I mean it. I believe you." He turned, and the lantern swung with him, cutting a path through the rain. "You coming?" She lowered the rifle. She followed him. The cabin was exactly what he'd said, a roof that didn't leak, a stove that was already warm from banked coals, 2 rooms separated by a plank door, and the particular smell of a space that had been lived in by one person for a long time. Pine resin and wood smoke, and something underneath both that she couldn't name. Solitude, maybe. The smell of a life that had made its peace with empty. Wyatt Callahan built up the stove without talking. He hung her coat on a peg near the heat and set a battered tin pot on for coffee without being asked. And he did not look at her except in the way a man looks at a situation he's assessing for complications. Clara stood near the stove and let the heat work into her hands and tried to figure out what she was dealing with. "How long to Holt's Creek?" she asked. "From here? Day and a half if the trail's clear." He didn't look up from the stove. "It won't be clear until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. Storm like this takes time to work through the passes." "My horse, I'll go back for her in the morning." He said it simply, the way he might say, "I'll check the woodpile," or "I'll see to the fire." Like it was a thing that needed doing, and so he would do it. Clara frowned. "You don't I know. I wasn't asking." "I know that too." He poured coffee into a tin cup and set it on the table without ceremony. "Sit down. You look like you've been standing out of stubbornness for the last mile." She wanted to argue with that. The fact that it was accurate made arguing harder. She sat. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, and the best thing she'd tasted in 3 days. She held the cup in both hands and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been that, and she did not examine it too closely because she didn't trust what she'd find. Wyatt sat across from her at the table. Not close. The table was wide and old, and he put himself at the far end of it, which she appreciated without acknowledging that she appreciated it. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Kansas. Millhaven." "Long way." "Yes." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the trail, that careful, practical look that didn't take anything from you. "Going to Holt's Creek alone?" "Yes." "Family there?" "No." She wrapped her fingers tighter around the cup. "A woman named Edith Morrow. She runs a boarding house. She wrote to the Teachers Association in Millhaven about a position." "School teacher?" 8 years. He nodded, like that explained something. "Morrow's a good woman. Holt's Creek's a decent enough settlement, considering." He paused. "Considering what it is, what is it?" "Young, rough. Still figuring out what it wants to be." Another pause. He seemed to think in pauses. This man, like silence, was something he was comfortable spending. "You'll have opinions about that." Clara looked at him. "What makes you say that? You've been talking for 20 minutes, and I've counted exactly 4 sentences where you weren't either asking a question or correcting something I said." She opened her mouth, closed it. The corner of his mouth did the almost smile again. "I wasn't correcting you," she said finally. "You told me the overhang was marginally better than nothing." "That was an accurate assessment. I said it was better than nothing. I was providing quantification." This time the almost smile made it all the way to a real one, brief and unexpected, like a door opening in a wall she hadn't known had a door. It changed his face entirely, made him look younger. Made him look like someone who had laughed easily once, a long time ago, and hadn't forgotten how just stopped needing to. "Get some sleep," he said, standing. "Other rooms got a bedroll." "It's clean." He moved toward the door. "I'll take the chair." "You don't have to. You'd feel better if I did," he said simply. "And it doesn't cost me anything. Good night, Miss Bennett," she said. "Clara Bennett." He paused with his hand on the plank door. "Good night, Miss Bennett." "Good night, Mr. Callahan." The door closed. Clara sat with the coffee for a while longer, listening to the storm work itself out against the cabin roof, and told herself that the thing loosening in her chest was just warmth, just the stove doing its job. Just a body coming back to temperature after too long in the cold. She almost believed it. Morning came gray and washed out, the storm having spent itself overnight and left the mountains smelling of wet pine and new mud. Clara woke to the sound of the stove being stoked and lay still for a moment, cataloging the unfamiliar ceiling, the unfamiliar smell, the unfamiliar sound of someone else being alive nearby. It had been 4 months since Thomas died. She got up before the thought could do much more than knock at the door. Wyatt was at the stove, his back to her, when she came through the plank door. He'd already made biscuits hardtack. Technically, the trail kind, but they were warm and solid, and he pushed them across the table without comment and went back to whatever he was doing with the coffee. Clara ate standing up, because sitting felt like settling, and settling this early in the day felt dangerous. "I'll go for the horse after I eat," he said, without turning around. "I'd like to come. Trail's wet. I know. Footing's bad. I grew up walking fields in wet weather." Another pause. He turned and looked at her. In the morning light, he looked different, more tired maybe, or just more visible. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the way he held his shoulders like a man who'd made peace with carrying something. "All right," he said. He meant it. That was the thing about Wyatt Callahan. She was beginning to understand he said things plainly, and he meant them plainly, and he didn't use words as decoration or defense. It was either the most straightforward thing she'd encountered in years or the most dangerous, and she hadn't decided which yet. They found Patience exactly where Clara had left her, shivering at the side of the trail, where the overturned wagon had finally given up any pretense of being useful. Wyatt crouched in the mud and ran his hands down the mare's left foreleg with the careful attention of a man who'd done this 1,000 times and wasn't performing expertise, just using it. "Not broken," he said, strained. "She needs 2-3 days rest and easy walking after." He stood and looked at the wagon. "This is done. I know. Anything in it worth salvaging?" Clara had thought about this on the walk down. She'd thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything now, because thinking carefully was one of the things she had left. Books, mostly. Some household goods. "We'll take the trunk," he said. "Leave the rest." She noticed the word. She did not comment on it. They loaded what could be loaded and walked back up the trail with Patience, picking her way carefully behind them. Wyatt didn't try to fill the silence with conversation, which Clara found she was grateful for in a way she hadn't expected. She'd been talked at these last 4 months, offered condolences wrapped in obligation, advice wrapped in pity. Wyatt Callahan walked in quiet, that asked nothing and took nothing, and somewhere around the second switchback she realized she'd stopped watching her feet and started watching the mountain. It was, she admitted to herself, beautiful. The kind of beautiful that doesn't care whether you notice it. "You've been here 3 years," she said. "About that." "You don't miss." She stopped, reassembled. "What made you come up here, to begin with?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Then I was guiding wagon trains over the southern passes. Did it for 8 years. Then there was an accident, a pause that had weight in it. After that I needed quiet." Clara didn't ask what kind of accident. Some things you could hear in a man's voice, without needing the details, the shape of a loss, the way it had rearranged him. She recognized it because she heard the same shape in her own voice when she talked about Thomas, and she didn't like strangers asking her to explain it. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a while ago. That doesn't always help." He glanced at her sideways. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." They walked the rest of the way in silence, and this time the silence was a different kind, not empty, but full of things neither of them needed to say out loud. She should have left the next day. The trail cleared by afternoon, the way he'd said it would. Patience was rested, or rested enough. Wyatt had repacked what could be repacked, worked out a route that kept to the better footing on the north-facing slopes, and drawn her a map on a piece of flat wood with a charcoal stick, which was the most practical thing anyone had done for her in months. She stood at the door of the cabin with the carved map in her hand and her coat buttoned against the morning cool, and Wyatt stood on the step below, not blocking her, not standing in her way, just present, the way a mountain is present, as something that exists entirely on its own terms. "You've been more than kind," she said. "I want you to know that I intend to repay." "No," he said. "Mr. Callahan, Wyatt." He said it without looking at her, scanning the trail like he was reading something written in the slope of the rock. "And I don't want repayment. I helped because it needed doing. That's all." Clara looked at him for a long moment. 8 years as a school teacher had given her practice at reading people out their words so much as the space between their words, the things they said when they weren't paying attention to what they were saying. What she read in Wyatt Callahan was something she hadn't expected. Not danger, not charity, Not the particular kind of interest she'd learned to be wary of from men who saw a widow traveling alone as an opportunity. What she read was loneliness, not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that demands acknowledgement. The quiet, structural kind built into the way he moved through his own cabin, the way he'd slept in the chair without complaint, the way he'd made 2 cups of coffee this morning out of habit before he'd even thought about it. She took a breath. "The offer Edith Morrow made me," she said carefully. It included land, a small parcel north of the settlement. Territorial provisions for widow homesteaders. She paused. "I've never farmed. I know land in theory. My father owned 300 acres in Illinois, but theory and practice aren't the same thing." Wyatt turned and looked at her. "You're asking something," he said. "I'm not sure yet." She held his gaze. "If I needed someone who knew this territory, someone who could help me assess what I'm looking at, tell me which land is worth claiming and which is going to break me, would that be something you'd consider?" A long silence. The mountain worked at them both. "I'm not a farmer," he said finally. "I know, I'm not a rancher either. Not anymore." "I know that too." Another silence. He looked back at the trail, at the shape of the morning on the high rock. Something was moving behind his eyes, a calculation, or maybe something older than calculation, something he hadn't expected to have to do. "Holt's Creek," he said. "I go into town once a month for supplies." That's not a yes. It's not a no. He stepped back from the door just slightly. "Get to Morrow's place. Find your land. See what you're actually looking at." He paused. "Then we'll see." She turned to go. "Miss Bennett." She looked back. He was looking at her directly now with that careful, undecorated attention. "You fixed a wagon wheel by yourself on a mountain road." "Yes. You walked into a storm rather than wait for someone else to solve your problem." "Yes. You pointed a rifle at a stranger and held it steady for 3 minutes in the cold and the rain." He paused. "You'll be all right." Clara stood with that for a moment. "I know," she said. She meant it. That was what surprised her. She meant it. For the first time in 4 months, she meant it. She turned and walked down the trail toward Holt's Creek, and she didn't look back, and this time, for the first time, not looking back didn't feel like loss. It felt like something else entirely, something that didn't have a name yet. But she had time to figure it out. Holt's Creek was not what Clara had imagined. She had imagined something rougher, raw lumber and mud streets and men who spat tobacco and didn't bother looking at you unless they wanted something. What she found was rougher than that, and more complicated than that, in the way that real places always are more complicated than the version you build in your head during a long, hard road. The settlement had maybe 200 people and the ambitions of 1,000. There were 3 streets, a general store, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, a saloon that didn't bother pretending to be anything else, and a boarding house at the north end of the main street, with a painted sign above the door that read E. Morrow Clean Rooms, Decent Meals, No Nonsense. Clara read that sign and felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, like she might be in the right place. Edith Morrow was a woman in her mid-50s who moved like someone who had stopped waiting for permission and couldn't remember why she'd ever asked. She had iron gray hair pinned with aggressive efficiency, a handshake that meant something, and the particular kind of directness that comes from having made every mistake at least once and deciding not to waste time pretending otherwise. She took one look at Clara, road-worn, rain-dried, hauling a carpet bag and a rifle and what was left of her composure, and said, "You're the teacher from Kansas." "You're late." "There was a storm," Clara said. "There's always a storm," Edith said. "Come in. I'll feed you, and you can tell me what actually happened." Clara told her over chicken and cornbread and the best cup of coffee she'd had since Wyatt Callahan's cabin, which she noted and then set aside. She told Edith about the wagon, the storm, the lame horse. She did not tell her about the man with the lantern or the cabin on the North Ridge, or the way she'd slept more soundly than she had in 4 months in a strange man's bedroll while he sat in a chair by the fire. Because some things you needed to sort out in your own mind before you handed them to someone else. Edith listened without interrupting, which Clara appreciated. Then she said the school position. You still want it? I came a long way for it. That's not an answer. Clara looked at her. I still want it. Edith nodded once. Then it's yours. 6 days a week, September through April. Pay's not generous, but it's consistent, and consistent is worth more than generous out here. She refilled Clara's coffee without asking. The land. You know about the widow provisions? I read about them. 40 acres, territorial grant, conditional on improvement within 18 months. Conditional on a lot of things. Edith's expression shifted just slightly, just enough to tell Clara that there was something here that hadn't made it into the letter. There's a parcel north of town that's been sitting under the provisions for 2 years. Good land, water access. But there've been complications. What kind of complications? Edith set her coffee cup down. A man named Harlan Briggs has been trying to acquire everything in the North Valley. Bought up 3 parcels in the last year. The widow provisions specifically protect against speculative purchase, which is why the Harlan Briggses of the world don't like them. She paused. He's been making it difficult for anyone to file a successful claim on that parcel. Legal obstacles. Paperwork that gets misfiled. 2 women tried in the last 18 months. Both left. Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not dread. Something more like recognition. What did he do? Mostly what powerful men do, Edith said. He made it inconvenient enough and uncomfortable enough and socially costly enough that it was easier to leave than to stay. A pause. He's not a violent man. He's a pressuring man. There's a difference, and it matters, and it also doesn't help you much if you're the one being pressured. I've been pressured before, Clara said. Edith looked at her for a long moment. I know, she said finally. That's why I wrote to Kansas. The land was everything Edith had said, and everything Harlan Briggs didn't want anyone to have. Clara walked it on her 3rd morning in Holt's Creek, alone in the early light before the heat built. With the deed application folded in her pocket and the particular alertness of a woman who has learned that the world tends to show you what you need to see if you pay enough attention. 40 acres of high valley grassland, a creek running along the eastern edge clean and reliable, the remnants of a previous homesteader's fence line, marking what had once been someone else's ambition. She walked the perimeter and felt the ground under her boots and calculated, the way she'd learned to calculate from her father, not the romantic version of land, that people who hadn't farmed liked to talk about, but the working version. What it would cost, what it would yield, what it would take out of you before it gave anything back. It would take a great deal. It might give more. She filed the paperwork that afternoon at the Territorial Land Office, which was a single room attached to the back of the general store. Staffed by a man named Dewey Potts, who had the look of someone who had been doing this job longer than he'd planned and had developed opinions about it. Dewey Potts looked at her name on the form. He looked at the parcel number. He looked at her. You know this parcel's been contested, he said. I know. Briggs has filed 2 separate challenges to the provisions in the last year. I know that too. Clara kept her voice even. Are the provisions currently in force? They are. Then I'm entitled to file. Dewey Potts looked at her for another moment. Then he took the form and stamped it with the kind of deliberateness that meant something. You are, he agreed. Come back in 10 days for the confirmation notice. He paused, and something in his expression shifted towards something human. Miss Bennett, I'd suggest you have your affairs well documented. Briggs doesn't fight with his fists. He fights with paperwork. So do I, Clara said. She walked out of the land office and almost directly into the broadest chest she'd encountered since Colorado. She looked up. Wyatt Callahan looked down at her with an expression that suggested he was revising something. You're in town, she said. Supply run, he said. Early this month. He looked at the land office door behind her. You filed this morning. A pause in which he appeared to think several things in rapid succession. Briggs already knows. How Dewey Potts is a decent man but a nervous one. And Briggs has a way of finding out. He shifted his weight, not restless, just realigning, the way a man does when he's making a decision. You eaten? Not since this morning. Come on then. They ate at the quieter end of the saloon's back room, the end that wasn't technically the saloon, but had a door connecting to it, which Holt's Creek apparently considered a meaningful distinction. Wyatt had beans and cornbread. Clara had the same, because the menu was limited and she'd stopped being particular about food, somewhere around week 3 of the road. She told him about Briggs while they ate. Not because she needed his help, she told herself that clearly, the way you tell yourself things that you're not sure you believe yet, but because he knew this territory, and that was a practical asset, and she was going to use practical assets. Wyatt listened the way he did everything, without unnecessary movement, without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Briggs has been buying the North Valley for 3 years, he said. Water rights, mostly. Whoever controls the water controls what can and can't survive on the land around it. A pause. Your parcel has creek access, I know. That's why he wants it. I know that too. Clara put her fork down. What I need to know is whether the creek access is legally protected under the widow provisions or whether he can challenge it separately. Wyatt's eyes moved to hers. Something shifted in them, surprise, she thought, though with him it was hard to be sure. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about it since Kansas. She met his look directly. I'm not going into this blind, Wyatt. I came here to build something. I need to know what I'm building against. Something settled in his expression. Not warmth exactly, or not only warmth, more like recalibration. Like he'd been holding a certain idea about her at a certain arm's length, and she'd just made the distance untenable. The creek's a tributary of the main watershed, he said. Briggs has challenged watershed rights twice, lost both times, but his lawyer's finding new arguments. A pause. You're going to need someone who knows the land can testify to water flow, historical access, usage patterns. That's the kind of evidence that wins territory disputes. Clara looked at him. You know the land, she said. I know this part of the mountain, yes. And you know water flow. I was a trail guide for 8 years. Reading water was half the job. Would you be willing to document what you know, formally, if it came to that? A long silence. Outside the thin walls, Holt's Creek went about its afternoon business boots on board sidewalk, a horse shaking its harness, 2 men arguing about nothing that mattered. The ordinary texture of a place that didn't know it was a threshold in someone else's life. Let me think on it, Wyatt said. I'm not asking you to decide today. Good, he went back to his beans. A pause. How's the horse? Mending. Edith has a good stableman. Clara watched him for a moment. Thank you. For going back for her. It needed doing, he said, the way he'd said it before, as if need and action were directly connected, and the gap between them was too small to require comment. Clara looked at him, this quiet, angular man, who spoke in plain sentences and moved through the world, like someone who had learned to cost it as little as possible, who had come down off his mountain on a supply run and ended up sitting across from her in the back of a saloon talking about water rights, and felt something shift in the arrangement of her thoughts. It wasn't the kind of thing she was prepared to examine closely. She examined it anyway. She had spent 8 years married to a good man. Thomas Bennett had been good genuinely, entirely, without effort. Kind to students, kind to his neighbors, kind to the old dog they'd kept past usefulness, because neither of them could stand to give up on anything. He had loved her in the steady, undemonstrative way of a person, to whom love was a condition rather than an event, like weather you lived inside of rather than weather that happened to you. She had been happy. She was certain of that. She had been genuinely, quietly, specifically happy, and then he had died of a fever in February, and the happiness had not so much left as revealed itself to have been a room she'd been living in without knowing it was a room. And now she was outside it, and the door was gone, and she was in Colorado. Wyatt Callahan was not Thomas Bennett. He was nothing like Thomas Bennett. He was, "You're staring," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About? Water rights," she said, the corner of his mouth. That almost smile. "Sure," he said. The trouble arrived on a Thursday. Clara had been in Holt's Creek for 11 days. She had started organizing the schoolroom, inventorying what existed, making a list of what was needed, writing letters to the Territorial Education Board about textbooks and chalk and the 3 window shutters that needed replacing. She had walked her land 4 more times, at different hours and different weather, and she had started to understand it the way you understand a person not all at once, but in the accumulation of small observations that gradually cohered into something you could trust. She had not seen Wyatt since the afternoon in the saloon. She had thought about him more than was strictly practical, and she had done her best to categorize those thoughts as logistical rather than personal, which worked about 60% of the time. Then Harlan Briggs came to see her. He came to the boarding house on a Thursday afternoon when Edith was out and Clara was in the parlor writing letters. He knocked, which was polite. He came in without waiting for an answer, which was not. He was a man in his late 50s who had the look of someone who had been telling a particular story about himself for so long that he'd forgotten it was a story successful, reasonable. The kind of man who built things and couldn't understand why other people found the building difficult. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I thought we might talk." Clara set down her pen. She did not stand Mr. Briggs. He sat in the chair across from her without being invited. He had a way of occupying space that was clearly practiced the ease of a man who expected rooms to accommodate him. "I understand you filed on the Larkin parcel. That's public record." "It is," he smiled. The smile didn't reach much past his teeth. "I wanted to talk to you about that before things got complicated. I've been working to consolidate holdings in the North Valley for several years. It's a sound investment strategy, and frankly, it's going to be good for this settlement when it comes together. A well-managed operation benefits everyone, does it?" Clara said. "It does. And I think a woman in your situation, newly arrived, without established connections, with a difficult legal situation already on her hands, might find that an uncomplicated fresh start elsewhere would serve her better than a prolonged dispute over a parcel of land that's going to require significant resources to develop." He paused. He let that sit. "I'm prepared to make a generous offer. Not for the land, since you haven't completed the claim, but a relocation provision. Enough to get you settled somewhere more hospitable." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She was thinking, with some clarity, about the 2 women who had filed before her and left. She was thinking about what uncomfortable enough and socially costly enough had meant to them, specifically. She was thinking about how Harlan Briggs had probably had this exact conversation with both of them, in this exact chair, with this exact smile. "No," she said. He blinked. Just slightly, just enough to tell her that he'd expected longer to get here. "Miss Bennett, I don't think you fully understand what you're—" "I understand completely." She kept her voice even, which was an effort, and she kept her hands still in her lap, which was a greater one. "You want the water rights that come with the Larkin parcel. You've filed 2 challenges to the watershed provisions and lost both times. You're hoping that I'm easier to discourage than the law." She paused. "I'm not." Briggs's smile changed. It got smaller and more specific. "You're a schoolteacher," he said. "From Kansas. You've been here less than 2 weeks. You have no connections here, no knowledge of how things work, no history with this land." He stood. "I'm offering you an exit that's dignified. I suggest you think about that." "I have thought about it," Clara said. "My answer is still no." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man filing something away for later, and went to the door. "I hope you know what you're doing," he said. "I do," she said. She waited until she heard his boots on the board sidewalk outside before she let herself exhale. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on the table and breathed and thought very deliberately about the 40 acres with the creek running along the eastern edge, and she thought about her father's 300 acres in Illinois. And she thought about Thomas, who had been gone 4 months and would have told her she was being reckless. And she thought about Wyatt Callahan saying, "You'll be all right," on a mountain trail in the rain. She believed it. She picked up her pen and went back to writing letters. The first legal challenge arrived 7 days later. It was a formal objection, filed by Briggs's attorney, claiming that the Larkin parcel's creek access constituted a contested water right and could not be included in a territorial widow's provision grant without a separate adjudication. It was dense, careful language that had been written by someone who knew exactly how to make a true thing look complicated. Clara took it to Dewey Potts, who read it and looked unhappy. She took it to the one person in Holt's Creek who'd been described to her as knowing anything about territorial law. A retired circuit judge named Emmett Hale, who ran the feed store and gave legal opinions in exchange for the pleasure of being asked for them. Emmett Hale read the challenge twice. He was a dry, careful man in his 70s who had seen the law used in most of the ways it could be used, and he had opinions about all of them. "It's a delay tactic," he said. "A good one. Briggs knows the creek access is legally sound under the provisions, but an adjudication takes time, and time costs money, and he's betting you don't have either." "How much time?" 6 to 8 months. Clara did the math. 18 months to prove improvement on the claim. 6 to 8 months tied up in an adjudication that shouldn't exist. What do I need to counter it? Evidence. Historical documentation of water usage, access patterns, the original survey records. He paused. And testimony. Someone who knows this land and can speak to the creek's status as an established waterway under existing territorial classifications. Clara thought about Wyatt Callahan sitting across from her in the back of a saloon saying, "I know this part of the mountain." She rode up the North Ridge the next morning. The trail was less terrifying in daylight without a storm, which she acknowledged was a low bar to clear. She found the cabin the way she'd found it the first time, by the particular quality of quiet around it, the way a space that someone has lived in alone for a long time has a different silence than a space that's simply empty. Wyatt was at the fence line on the western side of the cabin, repairing a rail with the focused, economical movement of a man who did physical work the way he did everything without excess, without performance. He saw her coming and set down the rail and waited. She told him about the challenge. She told him about Emmett Hale's assessment. She told him what she needed. He listened, the way he always listened, and when she finished, he looked out at the mountain for a long moment. "You're asking me to go to court," he said. "I'm asking you to provide a formal statement. Whether that becomes court testimony depends on whether Briggs pushes the adjudication to a hearing." "And you think he will?" "I think he's done this before and it's worked before, and the only reason to stop is if the evidence makes it not worth pursuing." She kept her voice steady. "Your testimony would make it not worth pursuing." Wyatt turned and looked at her, not the careful, practical look from the trail, or the recalibrated look from the saloon. This was something more direct, something that was asking her a question it wasn't quite putting into words. "This isn't just about the land," he said finally. "The land matters," she said. "I know the land matters. I mean, it's not just about winning the legal case." A pause. "You're making a statement. To Briggs, to the settlement. About what kind of town this is going to be." Clara held his gaze. Someone has to. The silence stretched between them. Around them the mountain worked at its own business, and the summer heat built slowly, in the clear air, and below in the valley Holt's Creek went about the ordinary business of a place that didn't know it was about to be asked to decide something. "I'll need to document the water flow," Wyatt said. "Historical survey comparisons, seasonal variance records. I kept journals when I was guiding. They'd be admissible as contemporaneous records if Hale can certify them." He was already thinking through it. She could see that the practical architecture of the thing, how the pieces fit. "Takes about 2 weeks to do it right. I have time, Clara said. You'd need to be there, he said. For the documentation to be properly witnessed, you'd need to be present. A pause. On the mountain. Clara looked at him. 2 weeks, she said. Give or take. He looked back at her, and there was nothing evasive in it. He was not backing away from what he was saying or dressing it up as something other than what it was. You'd stay at the cabin. I'd take the porch or the barn. That's not necessary. It is, he said simply, because you need it to be. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about Edith Morrow and the way she'd looked at Clara over breakfast that morning, and said, be careful, girl. Not of the mountain, but of what people will say about it. She thought about the 2 women who had left rather than fight. She thought about 40 acres and creek water and the particular stubbornness that had gotten her this far and probably wouldn't stop now. All right, she said. All right, he said. Neither of them said the other thing. The thing that was in the space between those 2 words, the fact of it, the weight of it. 2 people choosing a difficult thing, and the particular intimacy of making that choice in full knowledge of what it cost. They didn't need to say it. They both already knew. She went back to town and told Edith. Edith Morrow listened to all of it with the expression of a woman who had formed an opinion halfway through and was deciding whether to share it or simply store it for later use. 2 weeks on the mountain with Wyatt Callahan, she said when Clara finished. To document water access. For the legal case. Edith poured coffee. Set the cup down. Wyatt Callahan hasn't come off that mountain for anything but supplies in 3 years. I know. He hasn't helped anyone with anything that wasn't immediately and obviously necessary in longer than that. I know that too. Edith looked at her. So you know what it means that he said yes. Clara wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. It means the evidence is legally significant, and he understands that. Edith's expression said very clearly that this was not what she thought it meant. What she said was, be careful, Clara. Not because I don't trust him, I trust Wyatt Callahan more than I trust most things in this valley. But you've been a widow for 4 months and you're building something from nothing on land someone wants to take for you. And that's... She stopped. Reconsidered. That's a lot of need to be managing at once. I'm not managing need, Clara said quietly. I'm building a case. Yes, Edith said, you are. She didn't say that, too. But it sat in the room anyway, the way honest things do, waiting patiently for the right moment. Clara left the next morning. She went up the mountain with her carpetbag and Thomas's rifle and the deed application folded in her pocket, and she did not examine too closely why she felt, for the first time in months, like she was moving toward something instead of away from it. Some things you know before you're ready to know them. She had learned to let those things wait. The first morning back on the mountain, Clara woke before dawn and lay still for a long moment, listening. She had forgotten what real quiet sounded like. Not the quiet of an empty house after a funeral, which has weight and grief in it. Not the quiet of a boarding house at night, which is just the sound of other people's sleep pressed through thin walls. This was the mountain's quiet, something older and less interested in human opinion, something that had been before anyone arrived to notice it and would be here long after. She got up and built the stove fire herself. Because Wyatt was already outside, she could hear him moving at the fence line, the small sounds of a man doing the first tasks of a day that had probably started an hour before hers. She made coffee the way he'd made it that first night, strong enough to be honest. And when he came in, she handed him a cup without ceremony, and he took it the same way, and they stood in the early warmth of the cabin and didn't say anything for a while. It was, she realized, the most comfortable silence she had occupied in a very long time. We'll start at the eastern boundary, he said eventually. Follow the creek upstream to the watershed markers. I need to take readings at 4 points water depth, flow rate, seasonal sediment lines. He set his cup down. It's slow work. I know slow work, she said. Something moved in his expression. I know you do. They went out into the morning and began. The documentation was exactly what he'd said, slow, methodical. The kind of work that required attention and patience. and the particular discipline of caring about small things because small things accumulate into evidence. Wyatt moved along the creek with a measuring rod and a battered leather journal and the focused quietness of a man in his element, narrating measurements in a low, steady voice while Clara recorded them in her own hand. Because Emmett Hale had said 2 sets of records were better than one, and a woman's handwriting on the document established her as a participant and not merely a bystander. By the second day, she had stopped thinking of it as documentation and started thinking of it as learning. The land had a grammar she hadn't known. The creek ran differently in different sections, faster here, where the channel narrowed, slower there where it spread across a gravel bed and the differences mattered. Told you things about upstream and downstream, and what happened to the water before and after it crossed the 40 acres she intended to claim. Wyatt explained it the way he explained most things, without condescension, without performance, as if the information was a practical thing she needed and he was simply passing it to her. "The sediment line here," he said on the third afternoon, pointing to a band of dark soil along the creek bank above the current water line. "That's the high water mark from spring runoff, 22 inches above present flow. Consistent with the survey records from 1871 and 74. He made a note. That's what kills Briggs's argument. He's claiming the creek is a seasonal tributary, dries up in summer, can't be classified as an established waterway. But the sediment line proves year-round flow at sufficient volume." Clara looked at the mark on the bank. "He knows this," she said. "He does. Then why file the challenge?" "Because he's betting you don't." Wyatt closed his journal. "Most people see a legal document and feel the weight of it. They don't look behind it." He looked at her. "You look behind it." "My father sued a railroad," she said, "when I was 12. Over right-of-way on the eastern parcel. He lost, but I watched him build his case for 2 years. I know what evidence looks like." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "Did that make you angry, watching him lose?" "It made me careful," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a long moment with that particular quality of attention that she had stopped finding unsettling, somewhere around day 2, and started finding something else. Something she still didn't have a clean word for. "Yes," he said. "There is." They walked back up to the cabin. And the day folded into the particular domesticity of 2 people sharing a small space, without having planned to. She cooked because she was a better cook, and it was a practical fact, and he washed up after without being asked, because that was also a practical fact, and the evening settled into a rhythm that felt less like arrangement and more like something that had always been the right shape, waiting to be found. She didn't examine it too closely. She was getting better at letting things be what they were. On the 4th evening, he told her about his family. He hadn't planned to. She could see that the way the conversation had been moving in one direction, and then shifted the way his hands went still around his coffee cup. They had been talking about the documentation, about the timeline, for Emmett Hale's review, and then there was a pause, and the pause went a direction neither of them had steered it. "The accident I mentioned," he said. "On the trail." Clara didn't move. She didn't speak. She had learned by now that Wyatt Callahan said things when he was ready and not before, and rushing him was the fastest way to lose what he was offering. "I was guiding a party over the South Pass, October 3 years ago. Early snow, earlier than expected. I knew the signs should have turned back a day sooner." A pause. The muscles in his jaw worked. "The wagon went over the edge on the descent. 3 people were lost." He set his cup down. "My wife. My son." He was silence after that had texture. Had weight. Clara held it with him, without trying to smooth it over or diminish it, because it didn't deserve to be smoothed over, and she had enough of her own grief to know that the worst thing you could do to someone's loss was make it comfortable. "I came up here because I couldn't be around people who were whole," he said finally. Couldn't stand the way they moved through their lives, like nothing had fallen out of them. Like they still had the same number of things they'd started with. He picked up his cup again. "Up here, the mountain doesn't expect anything from you." That must have been a relief, Clara said. For a while. He looked at her, and then she asked quietly, and then it was just quiet. He held her gaze. There's a difference between peace and absence. Took me too long to figure out which one I was living with. Clara thought about the room that had been her happiness with Thomas, the room she'd found herself outside of after he died. She thought about the difference between a life that had ended and a life that was waiting. I know that difference, she said. I know you do, he said. The same way he'd said it that morning about slow work, and it meant the same thing, not sympathy, not pity, but the particular recognition of one person who has been somewhere telling another person who has also been there that they are not inventing the terrain. That night she lay awake for a long time listening to the mountain and thinking about Thomas and thinking about the way Wyatt Callahan moved through his own life, like a man clearing a trail, careful, deliberate, committed to passage without much thought of destination. She thought she might be beginning to understand him. She thought that might be the most dangerous thing yet. The twist came on day 8, and it came from a direction she hadn't expected. She had ridden down to Holt's Creek to collect the mail. Edith was holding for her a letter from the Territorial Education Board about the school position, and, she hoped, confirmation from Dewey Potts's office on the claim filing. She left Wyatt at the watershed markers and made the ride alone, which she'd done twice before and which had become, she noted, less fraught each time. She was learning the mountain's vocabulary. Edith met her at the door of the boarding house with an expression Clara had not seen on her before, tight, controlled, the face of someone managing something they hadn't yet decided how to share. What happened? Clara said immediately. Edith handed her 2 envelopes. One was the Education Board letter. The other was from Dewey Potts's office. And underneath those, folded separately, was a piece of paper that had not come through the mail. Someone left that at the door this morning, Edith said. No name. Clara unfolded it. It was a copy of a document handwritten, the penmanship careful and legal, the kind of careful that someone's was used to their words meaning things. It took her 60 seconds to understand what she was reading, and when she did, the floor did something that floors shouldn't do. It was a water rights assignment, dated 1879. It appeared to transfer the rights to the creek feeding the Larkin parcel to a holding company whose legal structure, buried in 3 lines of dense language, connected to Harlan Briggs. If it was real, it predated the widow's provisions. If it was real, her entire case collapsed. He forged it, she said. Her voice came out flat. She was distantly aware that she was very calm, and that the calm was the kind that lives right next to the other thing. You don't know that, Edith said carefully. The 1879 survey Wyatt has in his journals, it maps this creek as an unassigned tributary. It was never privately held. She folded the document back up. Her hands were steady. She was impressed by her hands. If this existed, it would have appeared in every subsequent land filing. It would have been on record with the Territorial Office. Dewey Potts would know about it. She looked at Edith. He's manufacturing evidence. Clara, he's done this before. This is why the others left. Something cold and clear was moving through her. He files the legal challenge to create delay and cost. Then he produces a document that looks real enough to scare someone who doesn't know what to look for. Someone who doesn't have access to the original survey records. She stood up. I have the original survey records. What are you going to do? I'm going back up the mountain. She was already moving. And then I'm going to prove it. Edith caught her arm. Clara Briggs isn't going to like this, I know. What I mean is, Edith's grip tightened just slightly. He's been doing this for 3 years. He's patient. And patient men, when they get cornered, stop being patient. Her eyes were serious in a way that was not theatrical. Be careful. Clara looked at her. She thought about the 2 women who had left. She thought about what patient men getting cornered looked like in a territory where the law took 8 months to respond. "I'll be careful," she said. She rode back up the mountain faster than she'd ridden down it. Wyatt was at the cabin when she arrived, which surprised her. He'd planned to be at the markers all afternoon. He was sitting on the step with his journal open and a look on his face that told her he'd heard something too. She showed him the document before she even dismounted properly. He took it. Read it. Read it again. The expression on his face went through several things in rapid succession: recognition, calculation, and then something that settled cold and certain. "This is Barlow's handwriting," he said. Clara stared at him. "What Gerald Barlow?" "He was a land agent out of Denver. Died in 1881. He held the paper up, examining the angle of the letter forms. "I spent 2 months in a Denver courtroom watching him write testimony. I know this hand." A pause. "Someone got a sample of his writing and copied it. Carefully, but not carefully enough." The cold, clear feeling in Clara's chest expanded. "You can prove that. I can document the inconsistencies. The 9 is formed differently than period documents. The tail curves right when Barlow curved left. And this," he pointed to a date notation in the corner. "The territorial date convention changed in 80. Someone using an 1879 document wrote the date in the 1881 format." He looked at her. "They made it look right for a person who doesn't know the period conventions." "But it's wrong. Briggs doesn't know we have the journals," Clara said. "No. He doesn't know you were in that Denver courtroom." "No." Wyatt stood from the step, and there was something different in the way he stood, not heavier, but more decided, like a weight had been picked up instead of set down. He's been counting on this being a fight between a widow schoolteacher and a man with a lawyer. He didn't account for someone who knows the mountain. "He didn't account for you," Clara said. Wyatt looked at her for a moment. "He didn't account for you either," he said. "Most people would have taken that document and started packing." "I'm not most people." "No," he said, "you're not." The way he said it landed differently than she was prepared for. She turned away and busied herself with Patience's saddle, not because the saddle needed attention, but because she needed a moment in which she wasn't being looked at the way he was looking at her. "We need to get this to Emmett Hale immediately," she said. "In the morning," he said. "I'll ride with you." She paused with her hands on the saddle. "You don't have to." "I know." She turned and looked at him. He met her look with the direct, undecorated attention that she had given up trying to deflect 2 days ago. "You're not doing this alone anymore," he said. "That's not about what I have to do. That's about what I'm choosing to do." A pause. "There's a difference." Clara felt something move through her that she hadn't expected. Not gratitude, exactly, or not only gratitude. Something more fundamental than that. Something that had to do with the specific relief of being seen clearly by someone who wasn't romanticizing you or pitying you, who was simply looking at you and deciding, with full information, to stand in the same direction. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They went inside and built up the stove and sat at the table with the forged document between them and Wyatt's journals open to the relevant pages. And they worked by lantern light until the oil was getting low and the mountain had gone fully dark outside, and Clara's handwriting in her record book got smaller and more precise as she got tired, the way it always did. The way her students had always teased her about Miss Bennett's handwriting gets tiny when she's concentrating, like she's trying to hide what she's thinking. At some point she became aware that Wyatt had stopped writing and was watching her. "What?" she said without looking up. "Nothing," he said. Then, after a pause, "Your handwriting gets smaller when you're tired." Clara looked up at that. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, unguarded in a way that he generally wasn't, or maybe just willing to be unguarded in a way he generally wasn't, which was a different thing. There was something in it that she recognized from a long time ago, from before she'd learned to look for it, something warm and specific and directed entirely at her. She held that for a moment. Then she said, We should get the rest of this transcribed tonight." "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Wyatt looked back down at his journal, and Clara looked back down at her record book, and the lantern light held them both in the small warm circle of its reach. And outside the mountain did what mountains do, went on being enormous and permanent and entirely indifferent to whatever was happening at the small human scale inside one cabin on one ridge. Clara finished her transcription. Her handwriting had not gotten larger. Emmett Hale looked at the forged document for a long time. Then he looked at Wyatt's journals. Then he looked at the side-by-side comparison. Clara had prepared the letter form analysis, the date convention error, the list of territorial office filings that would have referenced this document if it existed. He was quiet for so long that the clock on his wall had time to tick through a full minute. "Well," he said finally. "Well," Wyatt said, "this is either the stupidest thing Harlan Briggs has ever done or the most desperate." Emmett set the document down. "Probably both." He looked at Clara. "You understand what filing this with the territorial court means. This isn't just your land claim anymore. This is a fraud case." "I know," Clara said. "Briggs will escalate. He has money and connections and a lawyer who knows how to make things take a long time." Emmett looked at her over his glasses. "You have an airtight case and a credible witness, and the specific disadvantage of being a woman in a territory that doesn't always remember what the law says about that." "I have all of those things," Clara said. "I'm still filing." Emmett looked at Wyatt. Wyatt said nothing, but something in the way he was sitting communicated very clearly where he stood. Emmett looked back at Clara, then he picked up his pen. "I'll certify the journals as contemporaneous records," he said. "You'll need to file the fraud complaint separately from the land claim different jurisdiction." "I can draft both." He was already writing. "This goes to the territorial circuit judge." "Next session is in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Clara said. "That's fast for this territory," Emmett said dryly. "Consider yourself fortunate." She didn't feel fortunate. She felt the particular vertigo of someone who is committed to a direction and is only now beginning to see how far the drop is on either side of the path. But she also felt, and she recognized this, had felt it twice before in her life, once when she'd decided to take the teaching position in Millhaven, and once when she decided to come west, the specific clarity of having made the right choice. Not the easy choice, the right one. "Draft both," she said. Briggs's response came before the week was out. "Not legal this time. Social." Clara walked into the general store on a Tuesday afternoon, and the conversation in it stopped in the particular way that means it was about her. The woman behind the counter, a Mrs. Holt, wife of the settlement's founder's son, and therefore possessed of a social weight that had nothing to do with merit, looked at her with an expression she had perfected over decades of small-town disapproval. "Miss Bennett," she said. "Mrs. Holt," Clara said pleasantly. "I need flour and salt pork, please. I heard you've been up on the mountain, Mrs." Holt said. She said it the way someone says a thing they've been waiting to say since before you arrived. "For more than a week. Documenting water access for my land claim," Clara said. "Legal work. With Wyatt Callahan." Alone, Clara set her money on the counter. "The flour and salt pork, please. I'm just saying, Mrs." Holt said, with the very specific pleasure of someone who believes they are only saying that people talk. A widow woman, alone on a mountain with a man nobody in town knows much about, people are going to draw their own conclusions. "Then they'll be wrong," Clara said, "and they'll be wasting time they could spend on something useful." "The flour, please." Mrs. Holt got the flour. But the look on her face as she handed it over said very clearly that this conversation was not finished, that it had been deposited somewhere, in the communal account of Holt's Creek's opinion, where it would accrue interest. Clara carried her purchases out and walked back to the boarding house, and told herself that small-town opinion was a thing she had navigated for 8 years as a schoolteacher, and she was not going to let it move her. What she hadn't expected was for it to move Wyatt. He came down to town 2 days later earlier than the supply run schedule warranted and found her in the schoolroom, re-cataloging the textbooks, and she knew from the way he stood in the doorway that something had happened. "What is it?" she said. He came in, stayed near the door. "I've been thinking about the documentation," he said. "We finished the documentation. I know. I've been thinking about the—" He stopped. Started again. "I've been thinking about whether my involvement is helping or hurting your case." Clara set down the book in her hand. "Explain in this territory, a woman's reputation is legal currency. It affects how judges look at testimony, how juries read character evidence, how the settlement decides what kind of person deserves to win a land dispute." His jaw was set. He wasn't looking at her directly, which was unusual for him. "If Briggs can make the case that you've been," he stopped again. "That I've been what?" Her voice had gone very quiet. "That your arrangement on the mountain was something other than what it was," he said. "Then everything we documented becomes complicated. Because a jury that thinks you're a woman of questionable character is more likely to believe a forged document than a mountain cowboy's journal, regardless of what the evidence says." The silence in the schoolroom was different from the mountain's silence. This one had edges. "You're saying you should step back," Clara said. "I'm saying I'm thinking about whether I should." She kept her voice even. "Thinking about stepping back." He looked at her now. "I'm thinking about what's best for your case." That wasn't the question. A long pause. The sounds of the street outside boots, a cartwheel, someone calling a name pressed against the thin walls and didn't get in. "No," he said finally. "I'm not stepping back." He said it the way he said most true things, plainly, with the specific weight of something decided rather than performed. "I'm telling you what's in the room so you can decide if you want me to." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Mrs. Holt's face. She thought about small-town arithmetic, the way it added things up wrong every time. She thought about two women who had left, and whether they'd left because of Briggs's paperwork or because of Mrs. Holt's expressions, and whether the difference even mattered in the end. "The truth of what happened on that mountain is in the journals," she said. "In the water records, in your testimony and mine. Anyone who looks at the evidence will see exactly what it was." She paused. "Anyone who doesn't look at the evidence has already decided, and there's nothing I can do about that." "That's a brave way to think about it," he said. "It's a practical way." She picked the book back up. "I'm not adjusting the truth to manage other people's assumptions, Wyatt. I've been doing that my whole life, and I'm done with it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded once. The way he nodded when something was settled and the set of his shoulders changed, became less braced against something. "Then we're in it," he said. "We're in it," she said. She went back to the textbooks. He crossed the room and picked up the stack she'd already sorted and began shelving them without being asked, which was not a dramatic gesture and was not meant to be one, and which was exactly, she thought, the point. Outside, Holt's Creek had opinions. Inside the schoolroom, two people built something shelf by shelf in the afternoon light, and the opinions stayed where they belonged outside, in the street, with everyone who had already decided. 6 weeks to the circuit judge's session. 6 weeks was long enough for Briggs to do something she hadn't anticipated. She knew, with the specific instinct of someone who had been paying attention, that he was going to. She just didn't know what. Neither did Wyatt. But when she looked at him across the row of shelved books, she saw in his expression the same alertness, coiled, patient, ready. They were both watching the door. Briggs moved on a Wednesday. That was the thing about patient men. When they stopped being patient, they didn't ease into it. They arrived all at once. Clara was at the land office with Dewey Potts, reviewing the fraud complaint documentation that Emmett Hale had drafted, when she heard boots on the board sidewalk outside, not one set, but several. Moving with the coordinated weight of people who had decided something before they arrived. She looked at Dewey Potts. He looked at the door. He had the expression of a man who had been expecting this and hadn't figured out yet which side of it he was going to stand on. The door opened. Briggs came in first. Behind him were two men she didn't recognize, not cowhands, not laborers. Men who carried themselves like legal instruments, like they'd been deployed. And behind them, which was the part she hadn't expected, was Sheriff Dale Macon. Clara had met Macon twice. He was a careful man, the kind of careful that could mean principled, or could mean waiting to see which direction the wind settled before committing. She had not yet determined which. Miss Bennet, Briggs said. His voice was pleasant. It had been pleasant in Edith's parlor, too, right up until it wasn't. I'm glad you're here. Saves me a trip to the boarding house. Mr. Briggs, she said. She stayed where she was, at Dewey Potts's desk. She did not move toward him or away from him. Briggs set a document on the desk in front of her. My attorney has filed a counter-complaint with the Territorial Court. Fraud, specifically the claim that the survey journals being submitted as evidence in your case were altered to misrepresent historical water access. He paused. By Wyatt Callahan. The room went very still. Clara looked at the document. Her eyes moved over it with the particular precision of a woman who had learned to read legal language fast and without panic. The claim was detailed. It referenced specific journal entries, specific measurement records, and alleged that Callahan had fabricated or altered documentation to support a fraudulent land claim. This is absurd, she said. The Territorial Court will decide that, Briggs said pleasantly. You're accusing a man of fraud to counter evidence that proves your own document is forged. She kept her voice flat. That's not a legal argument. That's a delay tactic wrapped in paper. That's one interpretation. Briggs glanced at the sheriff. Dale. Macon stepped forward. His expression was the careful one, the one that hadn't decided yet. Miss Bennet, I've received a complaint that requires me to take a statement from Wyatt Callahan regarding the survey documentation. It's a formal request. He paused. I'll need to ride up to the cabin. Then ride up, Clara said. He'll tell you exactly what I'll tell you, because the truth doesn't change depending on who's asking. I'm sure it doesn't, Macon said. And there was something in his tone not unkind, not hostile, but carrying a cargo she couldn't quite read yet. But I'll need to ask him to come down to town for the statement. Clara looked at Macon, then at Briggs, then back at the document. Give me an hour, she said. She rode up the mountain in 40 minutes. Wyatt was splitting wood when she came over the ridge, and he read her face before she said a word. He set the axe down and waited, which was the right thing to do, and when she told him, he was quiet for the full length of a breath. They're accusing me of falsifying the journals, he said. Yes, to delay the fraud complaint against Briggs. Yes, he looked out at the mountain for a moment. His hands were still, which with Wyatt meant he was very focused. If the court entertains this long enough, the widow provisions clock keeps running. 18 months to prove improvement, if the claim is tied up in counter-complaints for 6 of those months. I lose the parcel, Clara said, without ever having the underlying case decided. That's the play. He turned back to her. He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to make the court irrelevant. I know. She looked at him steadily. Macon wants a statement. He's coming up. You can give it here or you can come down to town. A pause. I'll come down. You don't have to, I know. He picked his coat up from the fence post. You keep saying that. You keep saying you know. Because I do. He looked at her with the directness she'd stopped trying to deflect. But I come down because I want to, not because I have to. That distinction matters to me. Clara held that for a moment. It matters to me too, she said. They rode down together, and the morning was clear and too hot for early September, and she was aware in the specific, involuntary way you become aware of things you've been trying to process gradually, that whatever was happening between her and Wyatt Callahan had passed the point where she could manage it at arm's length. It had moved into the place where you either named it or started lying to yourself, And Clara Bennett was many things, but she had never been good at lying to herself. She kept her eyes on the trail and said nothing. Neither did he. Some things could wait one more day. Macon took Wyatt's statement in the land office, with Briggs's 2 legal instruments present, and Emmett Hale sitting in the corner with a notepad, which Clara had arranged because she wasn't leaving Wyatt alone in a room with Briggs's paperwork, without a witness who knew what the paperwork meant. Wyatt gave his statement the way he did everything plainly, specifically without decoration. He explained the journals. He explained the survey methodology. He explained the letter form analysis and the date convention error in the forged document. He explained when each entry had been made, why and how Clara's co-documentation established independent verification. He was not a dramatic witness. He was something more effective than dramatic. He was precise. Every answer was measurable. Every claim was sourced. He referenced page numbers and dates and distances with the fluency of a man who had spent 8 years reading terrain for a living and understood that the difference between accurate and inaccurate was often the difference between life and death. Briggs's men objected twice. Emmett Hale addressed both objections in the dry, economical way of a man who had heard worse and had all day. When it was done, Macon closed his notebook. He looked at Wyatt for a long moment. He looked at the counter-complaint document on the desk. "The forgery analysis," he said to Wyatt. "You're willing to put that in writing?" "Sworn already did," Wyatt said. "Emmett certified it 4 days ago." Macon looked at Emmett. Emmett nodded once. Macon looked back at the document, and something shifted in his expression, the careful quality giving way to something more resolved, the way a man looks when he's made the decision he was avoiding. "I'm going to have to forward this to the territorial court," Macon said. "Both complaints. The fraud charge and Briggs' counter." He paused. "But I want it on record that the evidence before me doesn't support the counter-complaint." Briggs's jaw tightened. Just slightly, just enough. "Sheriff," one of the legal instruments started. "I said what I said." Macon stood up. He was a medium-sized man who managed in that moment to occupy the room like someone larger. "File whatever you need to file, gentlemen. That's your right." He picked up his hat. "Miss Bennett." He nodded to both of them. "I'll be in touch." He left. Briggs looked at Clara. She looked back at him. The pleasant quality was entirely gone now. What was underneath it was still controlled. Briggs was not a man who lost control. She understood that now, but it was colder. More specific. The look of a man recalculating. "You should know," he said quietly, "that I have resources you haven't anticipated. And patience you haven't tested yet. You should know," Clara said, equally quietly, "that I've been a schoolteacher for 8 years. I have spent a decade being underestimated by people with more institutional power than me, and I am still here." She paused. "So are my students." Briggs left without another word. His legal instruments followed. The room was quiet. Emmett Hale looked up from his notepad. "Well," he said. "Well," Wyatt said. Clara sat down, because her legs had decided they were done performing composure for one afternoon, and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "Then, not entirely. But enough." He pulled a chair over and sat across from her, not close, but close enough. "You handled that well. I was terrified. You handled it well anyway." His voice was matter-of-fact, which was more useful than reassurance. "That's what handling things means." Clara looked at him. She was tired in the particular way of someone who has been running on clarity and stubbornness for weeks and is becoming aware that those are fuels with limits. "What happens now?" "Now we wait for the circuit judge," Emmett said from his corner. 6 weeks. Both complaints go forward together." He paused. "Briggs has made a tactical error. Counter-complaints that go to court alongside the original charge give the judge the full picture. He can't suppress your fraud evidence anymore. It's all going in." Another pause. "He didn't expect you to have evidence this strong." "He's improvising." "Improvising is dangerous," Clara said. Yes, Emmett agreed, it is. The next 3 weeks were the hardest. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen, while everyone waited for what would. The territorial legal system moved at its own pace, indifferent to the human cost of that pace, and in the meantime Holt's Creek had 6 weeks of opinion to develop, and no particular shortage of mouths to develop it in. Clara taught school. She had 12 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and they were the thing that kept her clock regulated. They needed her at 7 in the morning, and they needed her present, not distracted, not processing land law, not thinking about what Wyatt had said or what Briggs was planning. They needed her to be the teacher. She was the teacher. She was good at it. She had always been good at it, the specific attentiveness it required. The way you had to hold 12 different minds simultaneously, meet each one where it was instead of where you wished it was. Thomas had used to say that the reason she was a great teacher was the same reason she was a difficult wife. She paid attention to everything and accepted nothing at face value. She had argued with him about the difficult wife part. She hadn't been able to argue with the rest. Wyatt came to town on the regular supply schedule, and each time he came, he found her. Not conspicuously, he didn't arrive at the schoolroom door or the boarding house with any kind of announcement. He simply appeared in places she also happened to be, and they talked about the case and sometimes about other things and occasionally sat in comfortable silence over coffee, which was its own kind of conversation. Mrs. Holt had opinions about this. So did 2 other women whose names Clara had learned, because you always learned the names of people whose opinions were going to cost you something. What surprised her was how few people agreed with them. Edith, obviously, was firmly in Clara's corner, but Edith was also the kind of woman whose corner you wanted to be in, because she pulled it in productive directions. The feed store owner, a man named Gus Rourke, told Clara plainly one morning that he thought Briggs had been running roughshod over the North Valley for long enough, and it was about time someone had the paperwork to say so. The blacksmith's wife, a woman named Pearl Ashby, who had come west from Tennessee and had the specific toughness of someone who had reinvented herself once and knew how it was done, started sitting with Clara at the church social 3 weeks in with the air of someone making a deliberate and public statement. "You're getting support," Wyatt observed on one of his supply days. They were at the back table of the saloon's attached room, their table. She had started thinking of it, and then made herself stop thinking of it that way. "Some," Clara said. "Briggs's people are still louder." "Loud doesn't mean majority." He turned his coffee cup. "It just means louder. In my experience, loud is often sufficient to function as majority." She paused. "Until it isn't." He looked at her. "You think it's going to shift?" "I think people in a settlement like this are watching to see who wins before they decide what they believe," she said. "That's not cynicism. That's human nature. If we win in court, the people who were quiet will have always supported us. If we lose," she stopped. "We're not losing," Wyatt said. He said it simply. No performance in it, no attempt to make her feel better. Just the plain statement of a man who had looked at the evidence and drawn a conclusion. Clara looked at him across the table. "Wyatt," she said. "When this is over," she stopped, reassembled. "When this is over," she started again. "What do you want?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the thinking quiet, something more careful than that. "What do you mean?" "I mean after the hearing. After the claim is confirmed or it isn't. After Briggs is dealt with or he isn't." She held his gaze. "What do you actually want? Not for the case, for yourself." The question sat between them. Around them, the sounds of the settlement moved through the walls, ordinary, ongoing, unaware that anything was being asked or answered. "I haven't thought about what I want," he said slowly, in a long time. "I know," she said. "I noticed." He looked at her steadily. "What made you ask?" "Because I think you've been so long at not wanting things that you've convinced yourself you don't," she said. "And that's not the same as being content. That's just," she paused. "That's just absence dressed up as peace." He went very still. She held her ground. "You said that to me once," he said. About myself. Yes. She didn't look away. I recognize it when I see it in someone else. A long pause. The clock on the far wall ticked through it. I want the mountain, he said finally. I've always known that. But another pause. Longer. More costly. I think I want it to not feel so much like hiding. Clara held that carefully. The way you hold something fragile, not because it might break, but because it deserves to be held carefully. Then stop hiding, she said. He looked at her with that direct, undecorated look, and this time there was nothing careful about it, nothing calculated. It was just a man looking at a woman across a table and not pretending he didn't know what it meant. Working on it, he said. The twist came 14 days before the hearing, and it came in the form of a man named Ellis Carr. Clara heard the name first from Edith, who heard it from Gus Rourke, who heard it from a rider coming in off the Denver road. Ellis Carr was a land agent. He had been Briggs's primary transaction attorney for 3 years. He had processed every parcel purchase in the North Valley. And according to the rider, who had apparently been a very specific kind of useful to Gus Rourke, in an unrelated matter 3 years prior, Ellis Carr had left Briggs's employ 6 weeks ago, under circumstances that were, to use the rider's word, contentious. He's in town, Edith told Clara at breakfast. Came in last night. Staying at the Continental, not here. Did he say why he's here? Not to me. Edith's expression was the one where she'd already thought the situation through and had arrived at an opinion. But a man who falls out badly with Harlan Briggs and then shows up in the middle of a fraud case against Harlan Briggs isn't here for the scenery. Clara put her fork down. He knows where the bodies are buried. That would be my reading. He might not talk. Privilege, liability. He already left Briggs's employ, Edith said. Privilege doesn't protect a conspiracy. If he knows about the forgery, he might know more than the forgery. Clara was already thinking ahead, the way she'd learned to think fast but in order, each step leading to the next. If Briggs has done this before, in other counties, other settlements, Ellis Carr would know the pattern. Yes, Edith said, he would. Clara found Wyatt at the livery where he'd stabled his horse for the supply run. She told him about Carr in 4 sentences. He listened in 2 silences. We talked to him today, he said. If he'll talk. He came to Holt's Creek on the eve of a fraud hearing, Wyatt said. He'll talk. He was right. Ellis Carr was a man in his late 40s who looked 10 years older, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been deciding something for a long time and recently decided it. He was in the Continental's small front room when they arrived, and he looked at both of them with recognition that told Clara he already knew who they were. Miss Bennet, he said. Callahan. He gestured to the chairs across from him. I've been expecting you. Why are you here? Clara asked. Because I've been in this industry for 20 years, he said. And in 20 years, I have never seen documentation as sloppily forged as what Briggs submitted in your case. He usually pays for better. He paused, which means he's running low on something. Money, patience, or people willing to do it properly. You handled the North Valley transactions, Wyatt said. I did. Were they legitimate? A pause. Carr looked at his hands. Some were. The early ones, he exhaled. The ones after 1881. Ones after Briggs figured out what the watershed was worth, those were not entirely legitimate. Another pause. I told him I wouldn't process another questionable deed. He told me my involvement in the previous ones made my objections moot. He looked up. So I left. I kept copies of everything. I've been trying to decide for 6 weeks what to do with them. Clara looked at him steadily. And now you've decided. Your fraud complaint decided it for me, he said. Once someone else put it in front of a judge, I had a choice between being a witness or being a co-conspirator. He reached into his coat and put a leather folder on the table between them. These are the originals. Every transaction in the North Valley since 1880. Annotated with what was real and what wasn't. He paused. 3 of those transactions used the same forger who produced your document. I know who he is. I know where he is. and I'm willing to say so under oath." The room was very quiet. Clara put her hand on the folder and did not let herself feel what she was feeling until she had thought clearly about what this meant, and what it meant was not just her parcel, not just her case. It meant every questionable deed in the North Valley. It meant the systematic dismantling of 3 years of calculated fraud. Why now? The question was direct and not unkind. Why not before? Carr looked at him because before it was abstract, he said. A business dispute. A legal gray area I could stand far enough from to pretend I wasn't in it. He paused. Then I heard about the woman who filed the widow's claim. The school teacher from Kansas who rode up alone and documented her own evidence when the legal system was being used to block her. His jaw moved. My mother was a widow. Filed a claim in Missouri in 1863. Lost it to a man who knew how to use paperwork. He looked at Clara. I've been carrying that folder for 6 weeks. I was just waiting to understand what I was waiting for. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Briggs has a lawyer who's very good at making credible witnesses look complicated. He paused. But Emmett Hale is better. I heard he's on your side. He certified our journals, Clara said. Carr almost smiled. Then you're going to win. She told Wyatt on the way back to the boarding house, not because he hadn't been there he had, but because saying it aloud made it more real, made it a thing that existed outside her own head. We're going to win, she said. Yes, he said. I'm not saying it to feel better. I know. I'm agreeing because it's true. She stopped walking. He stopped a half step after her and turned. The street was busy around them mid-afternoon, the settlement doing its mid-afternoon things, and she stood in the middle of it and looked at him and felt the specific overwhelming sensation of something enormous about to resolve. I need to tell you something, she said. He waited. When this is over, she stopped. Started again. I know what I want. I know what I want the 40 acres to become. I know what I want the school to look like in 3 years, and what the claim will need in the first 18 months, and how much of that I can do alone and how much I can't. She held his gaze. I've been very honest with myself about all of that. I know you have, he said. I haven't been as honest with myself about. She stopped again. This was, she noted, the third time she'd started and stopped this particular sentence, which was more times than she allowed herself to start something and not finish it. Clara, he said, quietly, not rushing her. I don't want to do this alone, she said. Not just the land. Not just the legal case. She kept her eyes on his. I've been alone for 4 months, and alone for much longer than that in the ways that matter, and I came west to build something, and I know that now means something more than 40 acres and a school position and water rights, she breathed. I know that. I've known it for a while. I was waiting to be ready to say it, and I don't think I'm going to get more ready than this. The street moved around them. A cart went past. Someone called out a greeting from across the road. Wyatt Callahan looked at her, with an expression she had not seen from him before, not the careful assessment, not the almost smile, not the direct undecorated attention. Something that had all of those in it, and something more, something that was less composed than anything she'd seen from him yet, something that told her she wasn't alone in the specific vertigo of this moment. I've been hiding, he said. You told me that, I know. I stopped hiding, he said, somewhere around day 2 on the mountain. I just didn't say so. I know that too, she said. I was waiting for you to be ready. Something changed in his face. Something opened up. I'm ready, he said. He said it the way he said most true things plainly, with the weight of a decision rather than a performance. And then he did something he had not done before. He reached out and took her hand. Standing in the middle of the Holtz Creek Main Street, with the whole settlement moving around them, and held it the way you hold something you've decided to stop pretending you don't want to hold. Clara did not pull away. She did not look around to see who was watching. She looked at Wyatt Callahan and felt something she hadn't expected to feel again, not the room she'd been outside of since Thomas. because that room was gone and she wasn't trying to get back to it, but something new. Something she hadn't had a map for, because she'd never been here before. "The hearing is in 14 days, she said. "I know." "After the hearing," she said. After the hearing, he agreed. They let go of each other's hands with the practicality of two people who understood that some things had the patience to wait a little longer, and walked the rest of the way to the boarding house in the ordinary afternoon air of a settlement that was, whether it knew it yet or not, about to change. Inside the Continental, Ellis Carr was writing his statement. In 6 days, a copy of it would reach Briggs's lawyer. In 8 days, Briggs's lawyer would file for a continuance, which the circuit judge, a woman named Constance Ward, who had been appointed the previous year and had developed a specific intolerance for delay tactics dressed as legal procedure, would deny. In 14 days, they would walk into that courtroom. But right now, Clara sat at Edith's table and drank coffee and pressed her hand flat on the table not to stop shaking, because she wasn't shaking, just to feel something solid. It was solid. Everything solid had felt temporary for 4 months. This didn't. The morning of the hearing, Clara woke at 4. She lay still for a moment in Edith's spare room, cataloging the sounds of the boarding house, the creak of settling timber. The particular silence that comes just before a settlement wakes up, and she did what she had learned to do with difficult mornings over the last 5 months. She did not lie there and think about everything that could go wrong. She got up. She dressed carefully. Not the worn traveling dress, not the school dress. The one she'd packed at the bottom of the carpet bag in Millhaven, the dark blue wool she'd worn to the Territorial Teachers' Convention 3 years ago, which, Thomas had said, made her look like she meant business. She meant business. Edith was already in the kitchen when Clara came downstairs, which was not surprising, because Edith Morrow was the kind of woman who treated other people's important days as reasons to be useful at unreasonable hours. There was coffee, and there were biscuits, and there was a look on Edith's face that said everything she wasn't going to say aloud about how she felt about Clara Bennett and what this morning meant. "Eat," Edith said. Clara ate. "He's already in town," Edith said, meaning Wyatt, because there was only one he in this particular context. "Came down last night. Gus Rourke gave him the loft." "He didn't tell me he was coming early." "No," Edith said. "He's a man who shows up and then mentions it." She paused. "I find that more useful than a man who mentions it and then shows up." Clara looked at her. "You like him, I trust him," Edith said, which with Edith was a more valuable thing. "Now finish your coffee. The hearing starts at 9 and Emmett wants everyone there by 8:30. The Territorial Courtroom was the largest room in Holt's Creek, which meant it was a converted meeting hall with bench seating for 60 people, and a raised platform at one end where Judge Constance Ward had arranged a table, a gavel, and an expression that made it clear she had not ridden 2 days from the circuit seat to be wasted anyone's time. Judge Ward was 52 years old, compact, precise, and possessed of a legal mind that Emmett Hale had described as the sharpest in the territory. She had been appointed by the territorial governor over the objections of exactly the kind of men who objected to that sort of appointment, and she had spent the intervening year making those men regret their objections one case at a time. Clara walked in and found her seat at the plaintiff's table beside Emmett, and she did not look around the room, not at Briggs, who was at the opposing table with his Denver lawyer, a man named Forsyth, who had the careful grooming and cold eyes of someone who charged by the hour and was worth every cent of it, and not at the gallery behind her, which she could hear filling with the sounds of Holt's Creek settling in to watch. Wyatt came in and sat in the front row of the gallery, directly behind her. She didn't turn around, but she felt him there, the way you feel something solid when the ground has been uncertain, the way your body recognizes before your mind does that the thing it's been braced against has arrived to hold its share. "Ready?" Emmett said quietly. "Yes," she said. Judge Ward called the room to order, and the morning began. Forsyth opened for Briggs with the particular kind of legal elegance that takes a dishonest argument and dresses it in structures, honest enough to make the dishonesty hard to locate. He argued that the water rights assignment, the forged document, predated the widow's provisions, and therefore the provisions could not supersede it. He argued that the survey journals submitted by Callahan were of questionable provenance, prepared in anticipation of litigation and therefore suspect. He argued that Clara Bennett, as a newly arrived widow with no established history in the territory, was not the appropriate recipient of land that required significant development expertise to manage responsibly. He did not use those words exactly, he used better words. That was his job. Clara sat and listened and made notes in the margins of Emmett's brief, small careful notes in the handwriting that got smaller when she was concentrating, and she did not let her face do anything that Briggs's side could use. When Forsyth finished, the room was quiet with the specific quality of people who have heard a skilled performance and are deciding how impressed to be. Then Emmett Hale stood up. He was 73 years old and he moved like it, and he had been in more territorial courtrooms than Forsyth had years of practice. And he began with a sentence that Clara had not heard him rehearse and that she knew immediately was the exact sentence the morning needed. "Your Honor," Emmett said, "opposing counsel has presented a thorough argument in defense of a document that did not exist until 6 weeks ago." Forsyth was on his feet. "Objection sustained in spirit," Judge Ward said. "Mr. Hale, you'll need to demonstrate that." "That's exactly what I intend to do," Emmett said. He demonstrated it for 90 minutes. He walked the court through the letter-form analysis, the 17 specific discrepancies between the forged water rights assignment and authenticated samples of Gerald Barlow's handwriting. He walked them through the date convention error. He walked them through the absence of any reference to the alleged 1,879 water rights assignment in 4 subsequent territorial filings that would, by law and by procedure, have been required to reference it if it existed. And then he called Wyatt Callahan. Wyatt took the stand the way he did most things, without preparation of manner, without performance of any kind, simply present and straightforward, in the way of someone who has nothing to arrange because everything he intends to say is true. Emmett walked him through the journal records, through the watershed survey, through the 8 years of trail guiding, the professional context in which his familiarity with these mountains and this watershed had developed, through the specific measurements, the specific dates, the specific methodology. Forsyth's cross-examination was skilled and pointed and lasted 35 minutes and moved nothing. Because Wyatt Callahan, when asked a question, answered it. Not the question he wished had been asked, not the question that served a narrative, the specific question he'd been given, with the specific answer that question warranted. And when Forsyth asked questions designed to confuse or conflate or imply, Wyatt simply waited out the implication and answered the question underneath it. And the jury of 3 territorial assessors watching him do it had the expressions of people watching someone refuse to fall down. When it was over, Wyatt came back to the front row of the gallery and sat behind Clara, and she did not turn around, but she felt the quality of the room shift slightly, the way rooms shift when something has been established. Then Emmett called Ellis Carr. Carr was the thing Forsyth hadn't planned for. He could see it the way Forsyth's posture changed when Carr was sworn in, a small recalibration, the adjustment of a man who has encountered something outside his preparation. He had known Carr would testify. He had not known what Carr had. Carr put the leather folder on the witness stand. He walked through every North Valley transactions since 1880 with the methodical clarity of someone who had spent 6 weeks organizing this material and had made peace with the personal cost of presenting it. He identified the 3 transactions that used the same forger as the water rights document. He named the forger a Denver man named Cole Pruitt, who had a prior conviction for document fraud in New Mexico territory, and whose handwriting characteristics were, as Carr explained, recognizable to anyone who'd seen his previous work. He explained how he knew. He explained when he'd known it. He explained why he hadn't come forward sooner, in terms that were honest about his own culpability, and clear about why that culpability was not criminal under territorial statute. Forsyth's cross-examination of Carr was the most aggressive thing that happened all morning. It was also the least effective, because Carr had nothing to protect anymore. A man who has decided to tell the truth is, as Emmett had told Clara the night before, the most difficult witness to shake. You can shake a man who is shading the truth, because there are shadows to exploit. A man standing in full light has nowhere to shade. When Forsyth finished, Judge Ward looked at the leather folder for a long moment. "Mr. Emmett," she said, "Your Honor, the documentation regarding Cole Pruitt." "You have independent corroboration?" "We have a warrant record from New Mexico Territory, certified copy, and a handwriting comparison prepared by a Denver document examiner." Emmett paused. "We also have 3 affidavits from former clients of Mr. Pruitt who identified his work in previous forgery cases." Judge Ward looked at the folder again. Then she looked at Forsyth. "Counsel." Forsyth stood. He had a look on his face that Clara recognized not defeat, but the careful arrangement of a man deciding which way to fall. "Your Honor," he said, "I would request a 30-minute recess." "You have 15, Judge Ward said. Clara stepped outside into the September heat and stood on the board sidewalk and breathed. Wyatt came out behind her and stood beside her without touching her, which was the right thing, close enough to be present, far enough to give her room to be whatever she needed to be in the next 60 seconds. "He's going to settle," Wyatt said. "If he settles, Briggs admits to the fraud." "Yes. That affects all 3 transactions Carr documented." "Not just mine." Yes, a pause. "That's probably why Forsyth needs 15 minutes. He's calling Briggs right now and telling him that fighting this the rest of the way is going to cost him more than settling it costs him." Clara pressed her hands flat on the railing in front of her. The street was almost empty. Everyone who was going to watch was inside watching. "What if he doesn't settle? Then Judge Ward rules," Wyatt said. "And based on what I watched her face do during Carr's testimony, I know how she rules." Clara looked at him. He was looking at the street, reading it the way he read trails, reading the distances and the angles. "You're very calm," she said. "I'm not calm," he said. "I'm decided." He turned and looked at her. "There's a difference." She felt the corner of her mouth lift. "I know," she said. "You told me that once. You told me that once," he said. "I was just giving it back." She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh, the way it came out clean and genuine in the middle of this particular morning, the way the find finds its way back to normal human function, even at the edge of the things that matter most. She laughed, and he looked at her with the expression that was past the almost smile now, the full thing. And for a moment they were 2 people standing outside the house in the September heat, because the alternative was too heavy to keep carrying, and they'd put it down for just this 1 minute. Then Emmett opened the door. "Forsyth wants to talk," he said. Clara stopped laughing. She straightened. She pressed her hands flat against her skirt once and walked back inside. The settlement Forsyth proposed took 40 minutes to negotiate and required 3 separate modifications before Clara agreed to sign it. Briggs would withdraw the counter-complaint against Wyatt. He would withdraw the challenge to the water rights provision. He would acknowledge the illegitimacy of the 1,879 water rights document, not in terms that constituted a criminal admission, because Forsyth was very good and had protected that, but in terms sufficient for the Territorial Land Office to void it from the record permanently. He would pay the costs of the proceeding. In exchange, Clara would not pursue a separate civil claim against Briggs personally for the forged document. She thought about this for a long moment. Then she thought about what she'd come to Holt's Creek for. Not to destroy Harlan Briggs. She had no particular appetite for destruction, no investment in his ruin as a personal satisfaction. She had come to build something. She had come for 40 acres, with a creek along the eastern edge, and a settlement that needed a schoolteacher, and a life that was hers to make. The 3 transactions Carr had documented were going to the Territorial Attorney's Office regardless. That wasn't her case to settle. That was the Territory's. "Agreed," she said, "with one condition." Forsyth looked at her. The 3 North Valley parcels acquired under fraudulent documentation are reviewed by the Territorial Land Office for restitution to their original holders or their heirs, she said. That's not negotiable. I have no authority to negotiate it. Those aren't my damages. But I want it on record that the evidence in this proceeding is being forwarded to the territorial attorney. Forsyth looked at Emmett. Emmett looked back at him with the mild expression of a man who has all day. That was going to happen regardless, Forsyth said finally. Then it costs you nothing to agree, Clara said. He agreed. Judge Ward reviewed the settlement terms, asked 3 questions, and signed it. Then she looked at Clara over her glasses, with an expression that Clara filed away carefully, because it was the expression of a woman recognizing something in another woman. The particular recognition that moves between people who have been required to be better prepared than the room expected. Miss Bennet, she said, good luck with the parcel. Thank you, Your Honor. Judge Ward picked up her gavel, set it down without using it, and left the platform. It was over. The room didn't erupt exactly. It wasn't that kind of crowd, and this wasn't that kind of victory, loud and simple. It was quieter than that. It was the particular satisfaction of a thing resolved correctly, which doesn't always roar. It settles. It breathes. Edith found Clara first and said nothing, just put both hands on Clara's shoulders and looked at her for a moment. And what was in her face was something Clara would remember, the specific tenderness of a woman watching another woman cross a threshold that cost something real to cross. Gus Rourke shook her hand. Pearl Ashby embraced her. Dewey Potts, who had stamped her first filing with the deliberateness of a man making a statement, found her across the room and nodded once. And she nodded back, and that was its own entire conversation. Macon came over and said, the Territorial Attorney's Office is going to want those journals. He paused. For the broader case, the 3 parcels, they can have them, Clara said. Wyatt will make copies. Already planned to, Wyatt said. From behind her left shoulder, because he was there, had been there through all of it, present without pressing, close without crowding. Macon looked at Wyatt for a moment, then he extended his hand. Wyatt took it. You did good work, Macon said. She did the work, Wyatt said. I just knew where the water ran. Macon almost smiled. Then he tipped his hat and went. Clara turned and looked at Wyatt. He was watching Macon cross the room, and then he turned and looked at her, and they were standing 2 feet apart in the middle of the converted meeting hall with half of Holt's Creek redistributing itself around them. And she felt the morning's weight redistributing too, settling into something that wasn't tension anymore, something that was finally solidly the weight of something real rather than the weight of something threatened. It's done, she said. It's done, he said. I want to go see it, she said. The parcel, I want to go today. He held her gaze for a moment. Then we go today. They rode out after noon, just the 2 of them, and the September heat had built into the particular golden density of late summer pushing toward fall, and the land knew it. The grass carried the dry sweetness of a season beginning to turn. The creek ran lower than it would in spring, but steady, purposeful, exactly what the documentation had always said it was. Clara walked the eastern boundary with different feet than she'd walked it before. Not surveying, not calculating, though she was still calculating. Some part of her was always calculating, but with the particular quality of attention a person gives to something that is now theirs. Not triumphant, not relieved, something more patient than both of those. She stood at the creek and listened to it move. Wyatt stood beside her, hands in his coat pockets, not talking, which was the right thing. He understood that this moment wasn't for talking. After a while she said, the fence line along the south boundary needs to come down and go back up 20 feet east. The original homesteader miscalculated. I know, he said. I noticed that the first time we surveyed, you didn't say. Didn't seem like the moment, a pause. Is it the moment now? It's the moment. She looked along the creek toward the north end of the parcel, where the ground rose gently toward a stand of aspen. The house should go there, High enough for drainage, close enough to the water. Cabin first, he said. House after. She looked at him. Do you know how to build a cabin? He gave her a look. I built the one on the ridge. You built it alone. It's easier with two. Clara looked at him steadily. Around them the land held its particular afternoon light, and the creek kept moving, and the aspens at the north end caught a breeze she couldn't feel from here, and shivered slightly, and the whole 40 acres felt present. Like something that had been waiting without urgency, patient in the way that land is patient, for the right people to arrive and begin. Wyatt, she said. Clara, he said. I'm not asking you to come down off the mountain permanently, she said. I know what the ridge means to you. I know what the quiet up there gives you that nothing else does. She paused, choosing words carefully. But I'm asking you, not for the land, not for the legal work, not for any practical reason. I'm asking you whether you want to be part of what gets built here. He was quiet for a long moment. The creek ran. The aspens moved. I stopped running from things I want, he said slowly, a while ago. Right around the time a schoolteacher from Kansas pointed a rifle at me in the rain and then made the best cup of coffee I'd had all year. He turned and looked at her directly. I want to be part of what gets built here. It's going to be hard, she said. The first winter especially, and I'm going to have opinions about everything. I know. Specific, well-reasoned opinions that I will share at length. I know that too. The full smile. The one that changed his face entirely. I've been listening to them for 2 months, and I haven't left yet. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, the last thing, the last held tension, the one she hadn't fully known she was still carrying, and it left quietly, the way something does when it's done its job and doesn't need to stay. No, she said. You haven't. He reached over and took her hand, and this time it wasn't in the middle of the main street with half the settlement watching. It was on her land beside her creek in the September afternoon. With no audience but the aspens and the mountain above them, and whatever version of the future was willing to be patient enough to wait. She held on. The cabin went up in October, on the high ground at the north end of the parcel. 12 days of work that began with Wyatt and Gus Rourke and 3 other men from the settlement arriving at dawn, tools and timber, and the particular collective focus of people who believe in what they're building. Clara worked alongside them. Not performing capability, she wasn't interested in performing anything anymore, but because she was a person who built what she was going to live in. And the building was part of the living, and she had always known that. Pearl Ashby came the second week and helped with the chinking. Edith came on the last day with food and the satisfaction of someone watching a thing she'd helped set in motion arrive at its destination. Mrs. Holt did not come. Clara noted this and released it. Emmett Hale came on the day. The last wall went up and stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at the structure with the expression of a man who had seen a great deal of the territory's history and was quietly locating this moment inside it. It'll do, he said. Coming from Emmett, that was a standing ovation. The school continued. Clara's 12 students became 15 in November, when 2 families came in off the Denver Road and settled on the north end of the settlement. And she requisitioned new textbooks through the Territorial Education Board and reorganized the seating and wrote a very direct letter to the board about the window shutters that still hadn't been fixed, and the shutters were fixed by December. Wyatt came down from the ridge every week, sometimes twice. He helped with the fence line and the barn framing and the particular logistical problems of establishing a working parcel in the first Colorado winter. And he did it with the competence of a man who knew the land and the practical warmth of one who had stopped pretending that competence was the only thing he was offering. He stayed at Gus Rourke's loft when he was in town, because Clara's reputation was a practical asset and she was not done being practical. But there were evenings at the boarding house table, and mornings at the parcel where the work blurred into conversation, blurred into the ordinary intimacy of 2 people whose lives had begun to fit together at the edges, not dramatically. Not all at once, but with the specific patience of something that was going to last. The Territorial Attorney's Office opened proceedings against Briggs in November. The 3 fraudulent North Valley transactions were reviewed. 2 of the original holders had surviving heirs who came forward. The 3rd parcel reverted to territorial jurisdiction and was redistributed under the widow's provisions to a woman named Ada Crane, who had been trying to file a claim for a year and a half. Briggs sold his remaining holdings and left the territory before Christmas. Clara heard about it from Dewey Potts, who mentions it with the mild satisfaction of a man filing a thing that should have been filed a long time ago. "Gone," she said. "Gone," Dewey confirmed. His lawyer filed the transfer documents Monday. Clara thought about Briggs not with vindication, not with relief exactly, but with the particular quietude that comes from a threat resolving itself into nothing. Like a storm that finally passes and leaves the air clean, and the ground wet and the whole landscape a little clearer than before. "Good," she said, and meant it simply, and went back to her list. The first snow came in late November, light and early, gone in 3 days. The second came in December and stayed. Clara stood at the door of the cabin on the first real winter morning, her cabin, her land, her creek frozen at the edges and still running in the middle, and held a cup of coffee and looked at what she'd built. Not just the timber and the chinking and the door that hung slightly crooked, because Gus Rourke had miscalculated the hinge placement, and she had pointed that out with some specificity, and he had fixed it without complaint. The whole of it, the accumulation of decisions and difficulties and moments that had each cost something and given something back. She heard boots on the step behind her and didn't turn around. Wyatt stood beside her with his own cup. He'd come down the ridge the night before, ahead of the weather, which she had not asked him to do, and which he had done anyway, which was becoming a pattern she had stopped cataloging as surprising. "How's the fence on the south end?" she said. "Held," he said. "Third post needs resetting in spring." "I know, I've been watching it." A pause. "I know you have." The snow lay over the 40 acres in the particular silence of a first winter morning, and the mountain rose behind everything, enormous and permanent, and the creek caught light under its skin of ice at the edges. And the aspens at the north end stood the way aspens stand in winter, stripped and patient and entirely themselves. "I want to tell you something," Wyatt said. She waited. "3 years ago I came up that mountain to disappear," he said. "Not to die, I want to be clear about that. Just to stop mattering to anything. To stop being the kind of person something could happen to." He paused. "I thought if I kept the world small enough, I couldn't lose anything else." "I know," she said. "And then a woman from Kansas pointed a rifle at me in the rain and made me rebuild a horse and document a watershed and stand in front of a territorial judge and—" He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved and stopped being something I could keep at a sensible distance. Clara turned and looked at him. He was looking at her with everything visible, not the careful assessment, not the decided look, not the thing behind the almost smile. All of it. The whole of what 4 months of proximity and difficulty and honesty had made of the arrangement between them. The thing that had been building since a lantern crested a ridge in a summer storm and she'd held a rifle on a stranger and found something she hadn't known she was looking for. "I love you," he said. "I want to say it plainly because I spent 3 years not saying anything plainly, and I don't see the use of it anymore." Clara held that for a moment, not because she was uncertain. She was not uncertain. She was simply giving it the weight it deserved, not rushing past it into the next thing the way she had rushed past too many things in the last 5 months. Trying to stay ahead of the grief and the fear and the logistical enormity of building a life from a carpetbag and a rifle and $42 sewn into a hem. This deserved to be stood in for a moment. "I love you," she said. "I have been trying to manage that information responsibly for about 6 weeks, and I am finished managing it." He laughed, the real laugh, the one she'd heard that morning, outside the courthouse, the one that made him look like the man he must have been before the accident, and would be again now, was already becoming. It was a good laugh. She intended to keep hearing it. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into the specific warmth of someone she trusted with the full weight of herself, and they stood on the step of the cabin they had built and looked at the 40 acres under the first good snow of winter. "Spring," she said. "We start the south pasture fencing in spring." "March," he said. "Ground's workable by late March most years. And the barn roof the east side needs another layer before next winter." "I know. I'm going to have opinions about the barn roof." "I've already factored that in." She felt the laugh rise in her own chest. Held it for a second, let it go. Some things she had learned you let go of. The ones that hurt you. The ones that no longer fit the shape of who you were becoming. The tight, exhausted grip of a woman trying to prove she could do it alone, which she had always been able to, but which was not the same as choosing to do it with someone who saw you clearly and chose to be there anyway. Thomas Bennett had loved her in the room she hadn't known was a room. Wyatt Callahan stood outside in the winter air with her and built the next one board by board, and that was not a life, and it was not a consolation, and it was not lesser than what came before. It was the life that had been waiting at the end of the hard road, the one she'd ridden toward without knowing it was there, only knowing that she was someone who kept going. She had kept going. She was here. The mountain held the morning in its permanent, indifferent way, and the creek ran under its ice with the specific determination of water that has somewhere to be, and on 40 acres of Colorado High Valley grassland. A woman who had come west with nothing but will and $42 and a dead man's rifle stood with the man who had come up a mountain to disappear, and they were both irrevocably found.